Hey everyone, Happy New Year. I've wanted to make this video for a while now. First, to review my own thoughts as to what I've been loosely pursuing on the channel, and also to make clear for you what my method is philosophically and historiographically at the moment. To do so, I'm going to talk briefly about Foucault, who you're probably sick of, but just one more time for now, Antonio Damasio, Bourdieu, the Romantics, and then in conclusion, a bit of Deleuze and a little bit of what I think might be missing from the picture. So let's get started. To put it at its simplest, I'm trying to pursue a kind of ethical history and philosophy. My fundamental concern is to search through our history of ideas to attempt to understand the attitudes, assumptions and dispositions that we have in the present, and to examine how they arose and what their potential problems or maybe their benefits might be. Whether that's the history of a concept like healthcare or the ideas of a philosopher like Descartes, the purpose is always to ask, how does this relate to us today? To give an example, we might take the concept of the prison routine, as Foucault does, and try to understand why, historically and philosophically, it functions in the way that it does, and always ask, at least in the back of our minds, and potentially, how do we do better? Okay, so talking of Foucault, that might be a good place to start. What is it that he's doing? As I phrased it in my last video, a Foucauldian method is an attempt to identify the consistent and compatible signs that produce conceptual frameworks and set the criteria for what normal human nature is at any given time, while broadly depicting the dominant attitudes, perceptions and sensibilities any given society holds. Together, these phenomena form epistemes of beliefs that historically have changed over time. We might take, as we did a few weeks ago, madness as an example. Foucault says about madness in Madness and Civilization that he wanted to let classical culture, that's the Enlightenment roughly, formulate in its general structure the experience it had of madness, an experience which crops up with the same meanings in the identical order of its inner logic, in both the order of speculation and the order of institutions, in both discourse and decree, in both word and watchword, wherever in fact a signifying element can assume for us the value of a language. Okay, so we're looking for a structure, a conceptual framework of attitudes, of sensibilities, of meanings that fit together with an inner logic and might guide individual action. So to take a simple one, utilitarianism, the greatest good for the greatest number. I lay out some problems with utilitarianism as a way of thinking in my modernity series. In The Fist of Modernity, for example, I explored how 19th century attitudes, perceptions and sensibilities of criminality led to the birth of the modern police force in Britain. Now, the assumed logic of the period of the episteme suggested that urbanization was leading to an increase in crime, especially murder, when actually murder had been decreasing for centuries, and petty theft by the poor caused by poverty constituted the majority of offences. This justification is now seen in retrospect to be irrational, based on false premises. But at the time, people involved clearly thought they were being motivated by rational means and utilitarian ethics. But if the conclusions were not arrived at rationally, if there must have been something else going on, what was it? How were they arrived at? This is why I like to bring in a bit of neuroscience, like Antonio Damasio's Descartes' era, which I looked at last month, and you can have a look at that. For Damasio, we're not simply rational. That's not the only way we make decisions, even consciously. Our decision-making apparatus has an emotional, a somatic component. We make choices based on feelings, and that's what he calls somatic markers. He writes, for example, that when we are faced with the need to select a particular course of action, we make the selection not only based on the facts of the situation and the intellectual analysis that favours the most advantageous choice, but also based on the profile and intensity of the affective accompaniment of the intellectual process. Now, again, this is very complicated, and you can go back and have a look if you're interested, but somatic markers, the collection of feelings we get from our bodily and our mental impulses, have the effect of highlighting certain options for us to deliberate while eliminating others. They're a kind of screening process, Damasio says. Now, what I'm interested in is how somatic markers are arranged socially in a system. We can go back then to Foucault's idea of a consistent and compatible conceptual framework, which gives the appearance of being cohesive and rational. To take, again, a very simplistic example, when the modern police force was born, the idea of a criminal class was dominant in British culture. Organised, incurable, lazy, murderous, urban, a biological problem. One scientist at the time argued that by some accident of development, by some defect of heredity or birth or training, the criminal belongs, as it were, to a lower and older social state than that in which he is actually living. Ideas like this led to the hungry, petty thief being characterised as an incurable, evil and irredeemable problem, a blotch on society. And the rationalisation for the police force was motivated by this. All of these attitudes contribute towards somatic markers in our minds, which provide a kind of pre-cognitive structure to our thinking. We feel something, and information enters our conscious mind based on that feeling, before we think through information rationally and consciously. But how do we think more clearly then about the relationship between, say, Foucault and Damasio, or between the structural, the contextual, the environmental, and the individual, the personal, the subjective? These attitudes, feelings, conceptual frameworks, pre-cognitive structures become both socialized and individualized somehow. That is, they're consistent enough across a population and are subjectified into individual, personal, and slightly varying behaviour. Damasio writes that while emotions are individual, they follow similar patterns across individuals, having been shaped by biological and cultural evolution to respond adaptively to varied classes of individual and social situations. He then goes on and says that the actual development of somatic markers, the incorporation of an emotive response into the process of responding adaptively to the environment, is socially influenced. We can see affinities here with Pierre Bourdieu's sociology, which has also had a big influence on me. Bourdieu's theory is in many ways about social coordination, how our habits, our tastes, our ideas come to be synchronized across region, age, or class, for example. Bourdieu asked, famously, how can behaviour be regulated without being the product of obedience to rules? And he also phrased it as being orchestrated without being conducted. In other words, why is it the case that we are more likely to adopt or choose certain practices rather than others? The likelihood of enjoying certain music, for example, or adopting certain tastes in film and literature, or even theorising a modern police force in a specific way. It's all the result of what Bourdieu calls the habitus. And the habitus has similarities with Damasio's somatic marker theory. The habitus, Bourdieu writes, is a predisposition, a tendency, a propensity, an inclination toward a certain belief, attitude, and perception based on one's social position. Adopting a certain gesture, saying thank you in a certain way with a certain language, aligning yourself to a political group, enjoying certain films, art, music, literature, whatever it is, it rewards you with cultural capital. In short, certain things are approved of and certain things are not. Damasio writes that in early development, punishment and reward are delivered not only by the entities themselves, but by parents and other elders and peers who usually embody the social conventions and ethics of the culture to which the organism belongs. And he continues, it's likely that as we were being socially tuned in infancy and childhood, most of our decision making was shaped by somatic states, that's feelings, related to punishment and reward. Okay, so these three thinkers, Foucault, Damasio and Bourdieu, are complicated. So if you want to refresh yourself, take a look at my videos on them, and I'll leave links in the description below. But they're also, of course, not the only pillars of my method, but they do encapsulate a large part of what I'm trying to achieve on the channel. And of course, there are countless more influences. In all of them, also, I think we can see tacit, at least, critiques of the type of standardization typical of Enlightenment rationalism, that there's one way of doing things. This, I think, should always be resisted. But why? There's something left out here. The future. The future is where I'm unsure, what I'm interested in pursuing next. The post-structural turn emphasised how all of this inevitably moves, shifts and changes over time. It's never simply static. As Deleuze argues, every single moment is different from the last. Every tree different from another tree. Everything evolves, but we are structured by the habitus, by the episteme, by the pre-cognitive. So in that way, we always have something to fight against, something to analyse, something to try to comprehend. As Bourdieu says, in each of us, in varying proportions, there is part of yesterday's man. It is yesterday's man who inevitably predominates in us, since the present amounts to little compared with the long past in the course of which we were formed. Ideas of the past are embodied today in rulebooks, laws, institutions and attitudes, the abstract made concrete. How do we reattach ourselves to the past so that we can more effectively determine our futures? Now, Thinking about how to best pursue an as yet developed future is obviously a timeless and difficult question, but it's one I want to pursue further over the next year or so. I want to look specifically at theories of the future. The closest I've come to a starting point is Deleuze and the Romantics. It's very loose. They both emphasised how we cannot detach ourselves from the world, but are connected to it through our feelings, our affects, our imaginations. There's a powerful relationship between the embodied episteme, the structure, and our ability to imagine as yet unactualized worlds, new, creative and powerful worlds. We are, in short, a creative, innovative species. When we choose to look at, analyse or try to understand the past, or a philosopher, we do so with present concerns in mind, and we creatively imagine or re-articulate or put to use what they've said, even if it's in a very minor way. When a historian writes a history, for example, they imagine a narrative or choose their topic because of its suitability in the present for the future. Historians transform sterile chronicles, events and dates with no beginnings or ends, interpretation nor analysis, into stories by identifying, ordering and adding to that individual raw data that's contained within them. They produce narratives according to ideological, aesthetic and linguistic norms and beliefs in the present that have use for constructing a future. Every sentence we write is drawn from our moral and personal attitudes about the world and the world we want to pursue, and is in some way constructed based on our beliefs about the appropriateness of them, again, in the future. We are always thinking in terms of appropriateness, usefulness, aptness, and correctness. The Romantic historians shared these beliefs, and that's why I'm so interested in the Romantics. The Romantics idealised elements of the past, poeticising them in the present, with the intention of contributing to an improved human future. The Romantic historian Augustin Thierry, for example, wanted to write a national history of France so that the reader's imagination and human sympathy can attach itself to entire populations. The historian Thomas Carlyle called for stern accuracy in inquiring and bold imagination in expounding and filling up. John Stuart Mill praised Carlyle's The French Revolution for its combination of fact and feeling. The history of the French Revolution and the poetry of it both in one. The truest of histories, he said. So that's where I am. It's rough, it's always changing, and of course there are countless other thinkers and concepts that should be included here, and hopefully will be more in the future as I reinterpret and reimagine this process. To conclude, the purpose, the motivation is always to explain, to understand, so as to be able to carry forward those causes that have the general effect of being beneficial to us and to avoid the ones that tend to do us harm. The task of history is always ethical, always ideological, always creative, and always about the future. With all that in mind, to me, there's no clearer place to start than the history of genocide. If we can understand the causes, the warning signs, the conditions that lead ordinary people to commit heinous, destructive, murderous acts, then we might be better placed to inoculate our own contemporary societies from these seemingly timeless dangers. We might also learn some surprising moral lessons along the way too. And that's something I'll be turning to next time. thanks for watching, everyone. That next video on the Holocaust will come out in a couple of weeks, and it's going to be a longer episode. I've put a lot of research and reading into it. I'm excited is the wrong word, but I'm looking forward to putting it together. But work like that on a sensitive topic like the Holocaust will not get monetized by YouTube. So if you want to help out with that, help out with these larger projects, please support me on Patreon for as little as $1 per video. It's a huge help. It's the only way I make these videos, but please don't feel bad for watching if you cannot afford to pledge at the moment. Of course, it's a difficult time, so if you can't, just hit that like button, hit subscribe, share on Twitter and Facebook and all the rest of it. And most of all, thank you for watching. See you next time.